When most of our ancestors were beating each other over the head with sharpened rocks, the Chinese had an already ancient culture that began in the 20th century BC. While Europe languished during the Dark Ages, the Chinese enjoyed paper money and fireworks. For various and debated reasons, including invasions by the West, Chinese science and technology began to stagnate in the 1800s, and the country soon fell into the development status of a third world nation. But China is a country of occasional great steps forward, one of which began a decade or so ago. Even its legal systems evolving rapidly to accommodate its embrace of economic, if not political, freedoms. I was recommended for the trip by my friend Peter Carlisle, the District Attorney of Honolulu. Arrangements were made by the U.S.-Asia Law Institute at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, run by Professor Ron Brown and his wife Mang Mang. Our group included Hawaii State Attorney General Mark Bennett, Peter Carlisle's wife and college-age daughter, and the Browns' 3 children. We were guests of the SPP, the Supreme People's Procuratorate, roughly equal to the U.S. Attorney General's office, but a lot more powerful. The SPP is a vast agency headed by China's Prosecutor General, who oversees both the Supreme Court and 12 levels of prosecuting jurisdictions below that. Our 10-day stay involved 5 days of very formal meetings that included sharing lots of food with various Chinese prosecutors. And we had an equal number of days of either guided or unguided sightseeing around Beijing. The Chinese government paid all expenses. All I had to do was get myself to and from Beijing. It took 16 hours to travel the 5,500 miles from Portland to Beijing via the North Pole and through Tokyo. Despite the delightful comforts of an upgrade to business class thanks to the United Star Alliance, I was too zonked to get my camera out to document a small thing which foretold much about today's China. We were gently herded through Beijing's ultra-modern airport being readied for this year's Olympics along to Chinese customs and immigration. While the officer examined my passport, I was given the opportunity to rate my experience by pressing a button on a panel. Each button had a face ranging from a big green smiley to a big red scowly. Restaurants are using smileys so visitors will know whether an establishment has excellent, average, or poor sanitation standards. Fireworks in the shape of smiley faces will light up the Beijing sky during the Olympics. In fact, it seems the smiley face is the new symbol of China. Immigration was a breeze. I was greatly satisfied. The statistics are staggering. China's 1.25 billion people occupy a land area that is slightly smaller than that of the United States. More than 90% are Han Chinese, but there are many ethnicities and several languages and dialects. Measured in purchasing power, China's economy is second only to the United States. There are as many people in the Chinese middle class today as there are people in all of the United States. The Chinese enjoy low inflation and a GDP rate of about 10% a year compared to about 2% in the U.S. Even so, I had somehow expected a third world city with streets of bicycles and tiny oases of wealth. I was wrong. Even in Beijing, the hutongs, small poor neighborhoods, still exist. This one was behind our hotel, tucked in among new high-rises. But the wealth is undeniable, with cars, cell phones, and consumer goods everywhere. At a Chinese department store, the sticker prices were astounding, $90 for a polo shirt. But we were assured that Chinese people, absurdly wealthy ones, did in fact shop there. We were told informally not to drink the water, not even to brush our teeth with it. Apparently the pipes are at least hundreds of years old and teeming with xenophobic microbes. Peter's wife and daughter became so ill they had to be hospitalized after eating an egg pastry at an upscale shopping mall. Fortunately, Coca-Cola has a firm foothold in China. The name for Sprite means snow jade, and I drank a lot of it. We had no restrictions and could go as far as we wanted using Beijing's fantastic taxi system or public transit. One of those places was the vast Tiananmen Square, which you can enter through Tiananmen or the Gate of Heavenly Peace. We happened to be there on June 4th, the 19th anniversary of the government's crackdown on demonstrations against authoritarianism and Communist Party economic policies in 1989, during which somewhere between 300 and 3,000 protesters were killed or injured. We were all surprised to see a woman walking through the square, yelling and holding up a sign. Our interpreters said the woman was protesting communism. No one did anything to stop her, although she was being carefully followed by an unarmed social policeman. Perhaps if she'd been joined by a few dozen others, the reaction may not have been so benign. Interestingly, China Daily, the English-language newspaper, reported the winners of the MTV Awards and placed the blame for the antifreeze in Chinese toothpaste squarely at the foot of Panamanian importers. But the June 4th edition made no mention whatsoever of Tiananmen. A good description for China these days is authoritarian by consensus. China is an entrepreneurial state in which industry is rewarded. Their legal system is very concerned with battling corruption. The penalties are harsh, certainly for corrupt government officials. Just as we arrived in Beijing, the head of the Chinese Food and Drug Administration, Deng Xiaoyu, was convicted of taking bribes from 8 drug companies, allowing for tainted medicines and personally approving over 150,000 new and unproven medicines during his 8-year tenure, resulting in at least 100 deaths, including more than a dozen children. Deng was sentenced in late May to death while we were in Beijing. He appealed for leniency on June 12th, was rejected on June 22nd, and executed on July 12th. The Chinese media didn't reveal how, but it's believed they've switched to lethal injection from the firing squad. As part of the vital exchange of gifts, I brought several copies of Debating the Death Penalty, to which I contributed a chapter. The Chinese make relatively liberal use of the death penalty. One watchdog organization estimates about 7,000 people were executed in 2007. That's about the total number executed in the United States since 1976, and that was a 25 to 30% drop from the year before. In the last couple of years, China has instituted several reforms, including automatic direct appeal, similar to what we have here in Oregon. They place high value on true confession and contrition, and in cases where the condemned sincerely repent sufficiently, it is not uncommon for the appellate court to commute the death sentence. As old as it is, China is in many ways a young country. One way in which this is manifest is the relative youth of senior officials. A strict mandatory retirement age and program for government officials is one of the modernizations put into place by Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s to rid government of its most veteran revolutionaries. Bureaucrats at some of the highest levels now change almost yearly. At the time of my visit, the Supreme Procuratorate was not Cao Jinmang, now 48, but Jia Chongwang, now 70. The Chinese legal system is very linear. The country is divided into provinces, cities, counties, and town, each with its own prosecutor's office. We met with Wang Wei, deputy chief prosecutor of Beijing, who gathered her section chiefs, all in dark blue uniform, for one of several formal meetings at which there was a ceremonial exchange of gifts. I brought fancy canned fish from the Oregon coast, wrapped in Chinese paper. Our chief host was Dr. Ye Feng, who had many titles, even more than me. Dr. Ye's choice of restaurant is apparently a big hit among the new upper middle class. The Golden Jaguar is an enormous buffet that boasts food from every part of the world. There are more than a dozen food stations, with chefs preparing over 700 dishes, including a dizzying array of Chinese foods, many translated into odd English names. It was an astonishing sight, although the food was a bit mediocre. Every night was another culinary experience. One night we went to a Muslim restaurant for lamb that we communally boiled. We had Peking duck at what was said to be the premier restaurant for Peking duck, served with great ceremony by chefs in great tall hats and presented with a certificate numbering which millionth duck had been sliced and served with plum sauce. Despite all this hoopla, I was surprised to learn that Peking duck is a relatively informal dish, sort of a duck burrito. It was in the spirit of international cooperation that I also ate eel, donkey, and chicken feet, and I'm not talking about chicken wings. The Chinese flag, adopted in 1949, features 5 yellow stars on a red background that symbolizes the blood shed throughout the People's Revolution. The larger star symbolizes the leadership of the Communist Party, and the 4 smaller stars the classes: workers, peasants, small business owners, and non-governmental businessmen. Later interpretations have the stars representing the 4 categories of the people in the state: workers, farmers, intellectuals, and businessmen, and most currently representing the 4 largest ethnic groups. The different ethnicities are readily seen in the faces of the people in the Panmyophan market, where everything is bargained for. You offer a ridiculously low price, start to walk away, and when it is rejected, only get dragged back. This can go on any number of times. There are also many fancy multi-floored shopping malls jammed with small stores selling everything from suits to pearls. The same kind of vigorous bargaining is expected. In that spirit, one afternoon, Peter Carlisle was measured for and paid for a hand-tailored suit, which he got for about $85. It was promptly delivered to the hotel the next morning, a perfect fit. Heaven's Gate leads into the Forbidden City. I was so fascinated by it that I spent parts of 3 days there. The former imperial palace, right in the middle of Beijing, was built from 1406 to 1420. Despite its name, the Forbidden City, it is open to all. The Chinese themselves refer to it as Gugong, or former palace. Cell phone service is great, just remember that there's an 18-hour time difference to the West Coast. Starbucks opened a shop there in 2000. It was forced out in July of last year after protests that it didn't go along with Chinese culture. The Palace Museum has since opened its own coffee shop in the same place. I'm a big fan of the 1987 movie The Last Emperor, which won Oscars that year for Best Picture and Director. The movie documents the life of Pu Yi, emperor from 1908 to 1924, when he was expelled by a Chinese warlord. He went on to live in Tianjin, where he collaborated with the Japanese and was installed as the ruler of Manchukuo, a puppet state of Imperial Japan. He was captured by the Soviet Army at the end of World War II, testified against the Japanese at the Tokyo war crime trials, was then sent back to China by Stalin, spent 10 years in a re-education camp, and in 1958 was finally allowed to return to Beijing by special order of Mao Zedong. Pu Yi died in the late 1960s, an ordinary citizen of Mao's New China. Most of The Last Emperor was shot on location, and it is amazing to walk the same steps. The one time in recent history that the Forbidden City was closed was during the filming of the movie. Not even Queen Elizabeth, during her state visit, was allowed to break the set. The inner court was home to the emperor and his family and has several palaces. The Palace of Heavenly Purity, the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, the Hall of Union, and the Palace of Tranquil Longevity with its 9-dragon screen. The Qing dynasty's court was unimpressed when the Greenwich Royal Observatory was designated as the source of the prime meridian in 1885. The Chinese believed the stone carpets of the Imperial Way marked the center of the world. Only the emperor could walk or ride on the Imperial Way, except for the empress on the occasion of her wedding and successful students after the imperial examination. The bronze lions outside the imperial palace signify that an occupant is an official. First-rank officials have lions with 13 bumps on their head. This decreases with the official's rank. Officials of rank 7 and below are not allowed lions outside their gates at all. The male lion holds a ball under his paw, signifying power. The female holds a baby lion, signifying fertility. The roof tiles are yellow, symbolizing royalty. The walls are red, symbolizing happiness and auspiciousness. The more animals a roof sports, the more important the building. Palace thresholds are higher than the floors, so that you have to step over them to enter the next room. This is partly in respect of Feng Shui, which considers a threshold as a bridge or a rite of passage from one point to another, and therefore something that should be clearly marked and free of clutter. It is also a border that blocks demons from easy entrance. All of the buildings in the Temple of Heaven are round, and their foundations are square, reflecting ancient Chinese belief that the heavens were like a rounded dome and the earth was flat. Their roofs are tiled in blue, the color of the heavens and the sky. The altar of heaven was used to worship heaven at the winter solstice. It is 3 tiers of white marble, and each tier is made up of a number of stones that are a multiple of 9, 9 symbolizing the emperor. In the center of the top tier is one round stone representing the center of heaven, on which I took my turn posing. The phone number at my hotel ended in 9999. The echo wall surrounds the imperial vault. In the days before the din of tourism, one could hear a whisper spoken from the opposite side. The Hall of Prayer for Good Harvest is made of wood. It was constructed in 1420, but was burnt and rebuilt in the late 1800s. Not one nail was used. Inside the magnificently decorated hall are 23 pillars, each made from a single tree trunk. 4 posts in the inner circle represent the 4 seasons. 12 in the middle circle represent the months. Each of the 12 outer trunks represents 2 hours, altogether making a day. Our only view of rural China was during a trip to the nearby section of the Great Wall, which is great. It snakes for thousands of miles along the northern borders of several of the former Chinese empires. Apparently, it cannot be seen by the naked eye from the moon, but on a good day, if you know where to look, you could barely make it out from the space shuttle. Before coming to China, Mang Mang Brown asked me to pick a Chinese name. Converting an English name to Chinese is quite difficult. Mai Zhuanxi was one suggestion, but there's a fun website that helps you pick a name based on certain attributes and your gender and birthday, so why not? Using a combination of Eastern philosophy, Western astrology, the website, and chutzpah, I chose the name Mao Tianlong. Mao because it's a powerful name. Tian means dragon, and I was born in the year of the dragon, the month of the scorpion. Tianlong is dragon flying from heaven, and since I was flying from Astoria, well, Mang Mang howled with laughter, as did our Chinese hosts, who said that in Imperial China, I would have been executed on the spot for the impertinence of selecting names reserved for nobility. Of course, the main purpose of the trip was to meet our Chinese counterparts as sort of a diplomatic mission to further communication between two systems that see themselves as very different from each other. Most of our meetings were covered by camera crews from local television stations. Despite the relative ease with which most of the senior prosecutors spoke English, translations became necessary when we discussed plea bargaining of special interest to them and other legal technicalities. Invariably, there was a large meal served in the dining room of the prosecutor's office and prepared by their resident chef. We had been given some polite advisories by the U.S. State Department to observe the 3 forbiddens handed down by the Chinese government in 2003. They forbid open discussion of political or constitutional reform and of the Tiananmen uprising. But the higher-ranking prosecutors were eager to talk about the innovations and advances they had made and were continuing to make in the justice system, which certainly constitute political reform and even entails constitutional reform. And they were equally interested in how American prosecutors deal with similar problems. The prosecutors have relatively palatial offices, armed guards, and private chefs. Other than that, I was struck much more by what we had in common than what separated us. Most of the prosecutors complained of the same issues that we have in America: inadequate pay, unreasonable judges, excessive caseloads. We were told that the average sentence for a serious felony is about 2 years in a prison re-education camp. The Chinese take the idea of rehabilitation very seriously. According to their figures and taken proportionally, China imprisons about half as many people as we do. Of course, hard time in China is much harder than here, as many of their sentences, albeit briefer. Likely because of that, there seems to be little street crime and relatively few obviously armed police. Our hotel was near downtown Beijing, and we were out every night. I observed one street fight, apparently occasioned by drinking. A large crowd gathered, and unarmed social policemen jumped in to break up the fight. At China's Supreme Court, we met with one of the justices who reports to the Prosecutor General. Mang Mang's daughter Gracie sort of took control, and by the way, we were told that the one-child policy is largely not being enforced. We were shown a district courtroom. Courtrooms are public with plush spectator seating. There was a bench with a seat for a professional judge and 2 lay assessors, the closest they have to a jury, and a prosecutor's table. In Haidan, Beijing's high-tech district, we met Sun Li, the prosecutor general of that district. He has a staff of about 230 people, handles about 5,000 arrests a year, of which he estimates about 80% are property crimes. The National Prosecutors College and the Institute for Prosecutorial Theory are on the outskirts of Beijing. They serve as continuing legal education for senior prosecutors. China certainly aspires to the rule of law, if only out of economic necessity. Defeating counterfeiting, embezzlement, and of course corruption are their main interest. Foreign corporations and the Chinese people themselves won't abide a legal system that arbitrarily takes their property or abruptly deports a good portion of their workers off to some gulag. It would be bad business, which might be the worst sin in modern China. China has a very odd relationship with Mao Zedong, whose face is on every piece of currency. The country may have been brought from the Middle Ages to the 20th century under Mao, but there were also terrible mistakes, like the Great Leap Forward, which caused mass starvation in the late 1950s, or the Cultural Revolution a decade later that purged intellectuals. Mao Zedong thought has now been overtaken by Deng Xiaoping thinking. Deng insisted that economic development is the center of party work and that China's main policy towards the United States should be to avoid confrontation. As a result, China enjoys explosive growth while Communist Party rule is diminished. Change may be the mantra of politicians in America, but they can't hold a candle to the seismic shifts in China in just the last 15 years. The de facto anthem of the People's Republic of China during the Cultural Revolution was "The East is Red." After Deng assumed power, the song was supplanted by the March of the Volunteers, calling citizens to arise, arise, but against no one in particular, and for no one in particular, not even the party. Its lyrics are constantly being tinkered with, like everything else in Chinese society. These days, only die-hard Maoists or tourists with cigarette lighters sing communism's virtues.